Well, back when I was studying for the ministry, there was a man in my field congregation who stood about, I don't know, probably 6'4" and weighed about 230, 240 pounds. He was a retired gentleman, but he was still built like a football player. He had a flat top haircut. He had steely blue eyes that looked like they were just looking right through you, and he had a small tattoo on one of his forearms, although I couldn't make out exactly what it was. And this particular gentleman had a rather, as you can guess, a rather imposing physical presence. And just by his general demeanor, many people were afraid of him or intimidated by him. I, on the other hand, was not the least bit intimidated by him. And looking back, I think the reason for that is because I just wasn't smart enough to be intimidated by him. And so there was something kind of interesting about the guy, and so I was drawn to him, and so I approached him with all of the naivete of a dumb alley cat that walks out in front of cars on a busy street. And unfortunately, my intellect has not improved a whole lot. I still find, to this day, much to my personal embarrassment and chagrin, that I misread people completely, and I misread situations. Doesn't happen all the time, but every now and then, here's reality and here's David, and the two don't quite meet all the time, and it's a source of annoyance to the person I misread and a source of embarrassment to me. But anyway, I got a little bit closer to this particular gentleman, enough to the point where he told me his story, and it turns out that he was a retired deputy sheriff from the county sheriff's department, which everybody knew, but I hadn't up until that point. And he told me the story of how he got into law enforcement in the first place. This was the early 1950s, and he was just back home from Korea after fulfilling his military obligation there, and he was fresh out of the service, and he was just getting settled back into civilian life. He already had a couple of job offers. He was weighing them. One was from the lumberyard, and another, I think, from the railroad. And that was before the railroad left that particular town. And he was considering these, and so one particular warm evening, he decided to head down to the gas station. He was out of cigarettes and needed to pick up a pack of cigarettes. I mean, this was the early 50s after all. And so he went down there and got a pack of cigarettes and a bottle of pop. And as he was walking back out to his car, he saw two men engaged in a brawl, in a fist fight right there in the parking lot, and they were really going at each other. Well, he knew that wasn't good, and he didn't approve of such things, and he just instinctively took his pack of cigarettes and bottle of pop and tossed them on his car seat, and he went barreling full speed towards those two men and got in between them and broke up the fight and told them to take their fight and go elsewhere with it. Better yet, just go home and stop it. And they took one look at him and decided he wasn't worth tangling with. I don't blame them. And they left. And he didn't think anything more about it, so he went on home. And it wasn't more than just a few minutes after that one of his friends came running up to the house just breathlessly and banged on his door and said, "Wilbert," not his real name, but Wilbert, the sheriff is looking for you. He thought, oh man, I probably hit one of the guys, and he filed a complaint, and he was just wondering, what exactly he did. And he's thinking, gosh, I wish I had never gotten in the middle of that in the first place. And his friend said, no, the sheriff doesn't want to arrest you, he wants to hire you. And as it turned out, that very evening was the beginning of a 35-plus year career in law enforcement with the Carroll County, Illinois Sheriff's Department. And it all happened because he happened to be in the right place at the right time, depending on how you look at that, of course, to break up a fight. More importantly, however, his call to be a deputy sheriff came about because there was one word that best described him. That word is available. In fact, I should have titled today's sermon Available, or Availability. He was available to his community at a time when his community needed him to stop some nonsense. And in his case, that meant that he was to carry a gun and a badge for the next 35 plus years. There were two brothers, two commercial fishermen by the name of Andrew and Simon, who went out of their way one day and made themselves available to the Son of God. They knew, particularly Andrew, noticed that Jesus was not just an ordinary carpenter from Nazareth. He was no ordinary Nazarene. There was something very, very special about him, and he figured out that Jesus is the Son of God. And so Andrew and his brother Simon took an interest in Jesus. And the invitation that they received from Jesus based on their availability is in verse 39, and you have the passage in your bulletin this morning. Verse 39, Jesus said to them, "Come and see." They asked him where he was staying, where he was hanging out. He said, "Come and see." And so they went with Jesus, and the world has not been the same ever since. Let me ask all of you, as you reflect on your own life, has your life ever changed simply because you took a moment out of your normal routine, you went out of your way, and you made yourself available? Perhaps in a way and at a time and to someone that you never expected to. Maybe that's how you got launched on your career. Maybe that's how you met your spouse. Whatever the case may be, has there been a time in your own life when your life took a completely unexpected turn because you were available? That's how Lou Gehrig became a New York Yankee. Lou Gehrig was an undergraduate student at Columbia University majoring in engineering. Okay, he wasn't just a dumb jock. He was an engineering student at Columbia, and he played on the university baseball team. And one day when Lou Gehrig was taking batting practice, there was a talent scout from the New York Yankees that happened to be walking across campus, walking by the ball field, and he saw that Gehrig could really swat a ball pretty hard. And he went over to him and asked and said, "Have you thought about a career change?" And he wanted to talk to him about signing with the Yankees. And Lou Gehrig says, "Well, I'm here to get an engineering degree. Baseball is just a hobby." The very idea of playing baseball and getting paid for it, Lou Gehrig thought that was just absurd. But this talent scout persisted, and Gehrig made himself available to listen to the guy. And the result is baseball history. That's how the world learned about a man that became known as the Iron Horse. Another man who made himself available was Martin Luther King Jr. You know, if I say Martin Luther King Jr., what do you think of? You think of what? A civil rights activist, right? Yeah, he was. But he was also a Baptist minister, and specifically, he was a systematic theologian. I forgot exactly, it's a long title, but what he wrote his PhD dissertation in, I believe, was in the area of Christology. Martin Luther King Jr. was actually a systematic theologian, and that's what he set out to do. People who go into the study and the teaching of systematic theology are typically not people who are more oriented towards social justice and vice versa. But there was a particular need in our country at the time. And perhaps he felt God's tap on the shoulder, says, "I need you here doing this in this particular time and place." And so Martin Luther King Jr.'s life took a complete detour because he made himself available to his God and to his country. Here's where I'm trying to go with this. You see, the people who do good things are the people who make themselves available in the first place? How many times have you ever heard of a hermit or a recluse changing the world? With no disrespect intended to the good ones, the writers like Henry David Thoreau, I always mispronounce his name, but usually someone who holds up from the rest of society, they're not a world changer. You and I are here today because some Galilean fishermen made themselves available to God, to be used by God, and they followed Jesus around those dusty hills of Palestine for 3 years. And then from there they went on and they proclaimed to the known world that this Jesus had been crucified and was raised from the dead, and that there is in his name the forgiveness of sins. See, fishermen were an unlikely preacher. Fishermen were someone that no one would guess that God would use fishermen. They didn't have high status. Fishermen were precisely that. People bought their fish from them, but other than that, they didn't invite them to the neighborhood garden party or want to get close to them. They smelled funny. They were similar to shepherds. But yet, it was those Galilean fishermen who were the very founders of the church that you and I are a part of today. Why? Because they showed up. Because they were available. You see, God can use anybody who's willing to just show up. I'm always amazed when someone says, there's not a place for me in the church any place. That simply isn't true. There's a place for everybody in the church. God calls people, all kinds of people, every sort of person that you can imagine, to be his agents in this world. It depends whether or not they're willing to make themselves available to God and available to God's people. The good people of Carroll County, Illinois needed a man who could be a peacekeeper, even if that meant just breaking up brawls, and that's how Wilbert became a deputy. The United States of America needed a voice of conscience for equality among human beings, and Martin Luther King Jr. made himself available. The gospel needed to get out into the world, and some Galilean fishermen made themselves available to God. The church that you and I are a part of right now began as a result of someone's availability. It sustains and continues today, right in this moment, because of the availability of the people who sustain it. And it's the key to its future. Again, depends upon the availability of people who will see the church continue. Come and see is what Christ said to Simon and to Andrew. It was his call to them then, and it remains his call to us, to you and to me today. Amen.